Thank you. First of all, I would like to express my thanks to His Holiness for the opportunity to speak at this summit and to share the experience of Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago is a twin island state situate just north of Venezuela. We have a population of approximately 1.3 million persons with an economy based on petroleum and petrochemicals. Now, the strategic location of the Twin Island Republic, in relation to South America and the rest of the Western Hemisphere and Europe has unfortunately given the country a key role in the transportation of narcotics. Now, this is linked to human trafficking in that the very same routes and means by which drug traffickers engage in their illicit trade is the same routes that are used for human trafficking. Trinidad and Tobago is a destination, source, and transit country for women and children subjected to trafficking in persons. And specifically, these victims are usually put into forced prostitution and children and men in conditions of forced labor. Most of the women and girls come from Colombia, the Dominican Republic, Venezuela, and Suriname. They are then put into prostitution in brothels and clubs in Trinidad, and many of them have been identified as trafficking victims. Trinidadians have been trafficked as well to the United Kingdom and the United States. Yes, thank you. Undocumented economic migrants from the region and from Asia may be vulnerable to forced labor and forced prostitution in Trinidad and Tobago. As a hub for regional travel, Trinidad and Tobago is also used by international traffickers to move persons from South American destinations to Europe. Now, as a colleague of mine, my colleague from Jamaica indicated, the US State Department has been engaged in the monitoring of countries insofar as human trafficking is concerned. And Trinidad and Tobago has been placed on a tier 2 watch list on the ground that not enough had been done to date in order to address this heinous crime. And what was specifically identified was the fact that there have not been a sufficient number of prosecutions and convictions of human traffickers in Trinidad and Tobago. We have passed a Trafficking in Persons Act in 2011, and the offenses of trafficking in persons and trafficking in children are serious offenses. The object of the Act really is to secure the prevention and the prosecution of persons involved in the trafficking of individuals. And the Act also ensures, or rather promotes, the cooperation between Trinidad and Tobago and other states to prevent and suppress trafficking. Trinidad and Tobago Counter-Trafficking Unit was established in 2013 with a responsibility to investigate trafficking matters and refer them to the Director of Public Prosecutions for prosecution, to operate a hotline and receive and analyze information, prepare public awareness campaigns and programs, and report to the Parliament. Now, there have been a few prosecutions of persons engaged in human trafficking in Trinidad and Tobago. The cases are few. There have only been 35 cases and as yet no conviction. One of the issues identified in Trinidad and Tobago is that of the involvement of the police in this criminal activity. And as a matter of fact, several police officers have been arrested and charged with this offense. Now, the counter-trafficking unit has led the efforts to investigate trafficked and forced labor in the country, and they are staffed by a legal advisor, communications officer, and police officers. The unit trained more than 100 government officials on trafficking indicators and collaborated with authorities in Venezuela to investigate a suspected trafficking ring. In December 2016, the counter-trafficking unit identified a trafficking network in which immigration and police officers were implicated in facilitating the sex trafficking of Venezuelan women by helping to regularize the victims' immigration status and providing protection to the victims. This investigation is ongoing, and persons continue to be charged as the evidence comes forth. Now, there is a sustained effort to sensitize and make aware the public and certain important institutions in the country about human trafficking, because although the problem has been identified, yet because of the lack of prosecutions, what is also recognized is the fact that there has not been sufficient reporting and or investigation of the crimes. So that a campaign is underway at present to train persons to recognize victims of human trafficking. And this campaign has been extended to secondary schools, government agencies, the protective services, primary schools, hotels, and police youth clubs. Now, very often what happens in our country is that persons who are seeking jobs, whether from the region or South America, they may respond to certain ads, and when they come into Trinidad and Tobago, they are picked up and at least initially taken to hotels, the smaller hotels, before they are taken to the places of forced labor. And so it is a very important initiative to sensitize hotel operators to recognize the victims of trafficking. This training and sensitization has been extended to the consular officers in Trinidad and Tobago because there have been cases where persons have been able to escape from their traffickers, and sometimes they are aware enough to go to the consulate offices. Judges and magistrates are receiving ongoing training because very often it is the magistrate who is the first instance judge who may be the first contact with a trafficked person, in that the police very often conduct raids at these brothels and places of ill repute. And very often it is reported 25, 30 women are picked up, and it is the magistrate who must then question these persons and ascertain that in fact they are victims. We do have programs in place to treat with the victims of trafficking. Once they have been identified, then they are removed from the police system, the judicial system. They are put into shelters. In fact, Trinidad and Tobago right now, we do collaborate with Venezuela in particular to repatriate victims and, where necessary, in some cases, to allow them to remain in Trinidad and Tobago. Because what has emerged is the fact that very often victims do not want to return to their home country because the traffickers have a very professional ring, and it's quite possible that they may be picked up again. So where possible, we keep them. So even the hearing impaired and prison officers and people generally have been sensitized to this issue. Now, I said earlier that the issue of drug trafficking in Trinidad and Tobago and human trafficking are connected. because it's the same persons who are involved in both trades. Trinidad and Tobago, unfortunately, has very porous borders. We do have a Coast Guard, but they're not sufficient in strength, nor indeed in equipment, to police our borders. As a result, drugs are brought in from South America to Trinidad, and very often women and children also come by that route, by the sea. And from Trinidad and Tobago, they're then, as I said before, shipped elsewhere. Now, there are cells operating within our country, both to manage the drugs and the trafficking in persons. And we do collaborate, rather, with the Drug Enforcement Agency in the United States, and sometimes with Canadian law enforcement, to gather intelligence so as to break up these rings and, in fact, to get to the source of the problems, to get the victims, and as well to collect drugs. The importance of dismantling the drug trade in Trinidad, insofar as it pertains to human trafficking, is very often women are used as mules to traffic drugs from one destination to another, so that the traffickers very often pay the transportation costs to bring women to Trinidad. They swallow the pellets, whether they be marijuana or cocaine, and then they purchase their tickets to go to North America, Canada, or Europe to transport the drugs. But when these women are arrested, unlike the victims of human trafficking who will give up their traffickers, the victims who are used in this way to transport drugs will not give up the name of their bosses. And I think it's because of the violence involved in the drug trade. But the consequence for women and girls and children are dire, in that when they're caught, as I said before, they face the serious sentences imposed for drug trafficking. They sometimes die ingesting the pellets, the drugs, and sometimes the drugs, you know, they rupture inside of them. And so that whichever way it is looked at, whether as a victim of human trafficking or a victim of the drug traffickers, we have a serious issue that we have to take a multidimensional approach to in order to bring justice and equity. So we are working very hard in Trinidad and Tobago, recognizing the difficulty of the situation that we are treating with. We understand the importance of education and sensitization in order to break through into this problem. And I want to say as well that I am grateful for every opportunity to learn from the experiences of my sisters here. Thank you very much.